Hello and welcome back. This will be the second of the two lectures that I'm recording on ancient Jewish and early Christian art, primarily focused on the great site of Dura Europos. Last lecture was on the synagogue at Dura Europos, and then we looked at a couple of other examples of ancient Jewish art. This time we are going to, so that was here, the synagogue. Now we're going to stroll down the street here, passing right by Main Street, and go to this place that is a so-called house church. Now, the Latin term for that is domus ecclesiae. That literally means house church in Latin. And so that's what it's often still called today. And what you can see here are two diagrams of the space before and after it was renovated. Because the thing is, before it was a church, it was a house. That's why we call it a house church. On the left is when it was a house, and on the right is as it was modified. You can see they only made a few changes. So this wall that's here is gone here. And then they've added a little space here. And what this is this was the main prayer hall. And they took out the wall so that there was room for more people in there as the very small early Christian community was slowly growing there. And then this space here was for the altar. And then if you go into this little back room, which is probably what we would now call a sacristy, that's the place the priest goes to prepare before coming out for services, you can see that there's two little niches that were cut into the wall there that were not originally present. And what those are probably the space where he kept the items for the Eucharist, that is to say, the wine and the bread that either symbolically or literally, depending on the version of Christianity being practiced, either symbolically or literally turns into the blood and body of Jesus. That question is not really settled in early Christian in early Christian Christianity, and it's not really settled in medieval Christianity until the year 1215, when the Pope declares it's a literal miracle. Though other versions of Christianity will dispute that at the time, and eventually most Protestant groups in the modern world will take it symbolically, whereas Catholics will still view it, Catholics being the version of Christianity that grew out of what we call the Western Church, the Latin Church, the Roman Church in the Middle Ages. They will still generally take it as a literal miracle. So that's probably for the Eucharist or the host. Those two words both mean the same thing. They refer to the bread that becomes body symbolically or literally, miraculously, and the wine that becomes blood, again, symbolically or miraculously, according to believers. The other main change they made was right here. So you see there's nothing over there here, and this is here. And what this is a baptismal font. And here's a little cutaway that gives us a view of what the place originally looked like. It has a nice courtyard in here. And here's that baptismal font. Now, baptism was really, really important in early Christianity. The reason for that is because pretty much everybody in the Christian community was a convert at that point. This is not a period where, people are just born into Christian families and raised as Christian. There are very, very, very few Christians in the 3rd century when this place is being built and modified. And so just about everybody who is part of the Christian community is a convert from another religion. That might be from Judaism, or it might be from Roman polytheism, or might be from something else entirely, but those would be the two most common. And so the ritual whereby a person joins the Christian community officially is called baptism. And this is in the ancient period, it was a complete submersion of a person into water. Sometimes now it's just a little bit of water poured on the forehead. But it was really, really central. It was a very deliberate act, and only adults could take baptism in this period because they believed Christianity is very complicated. It is, like all religions. And it takes an adult to understand the religion, and they didn't want people declaring themselves Christians until they really understood the religion. And so only adults would become full-fledged members of the Christian community, and only adults, therefore, would be baptized into it. And so you could hang out in the hall with other people, hearing the preaching, learning about the stories, myths, legends, the characters, the theology writ large, before deciding, and then could decide and then be baptized. Now, This is what the place looked like when archaeologists first got there. You can see that it's just completely packed up with dirt and rubble. And this accounts for the very poor condition here. But this part right here is the baptistry itself. And you can see a figure here standing with a sheep on his shoulders. And ooh, these are really, really bad illustrations, really bad images, but bear with me on it, because this is the baptistry itself. And you can see, just like we saw with the synagogue, this is that back wall. The rubble line is sloped here, and everything above that is reconstruction because it was all worn away. And so what we're going to do is we're going to look at this form here, this kind of lunette, this half circle that's above what looks like a big bathtub, and that bathtub is the baptismal font. That's where the person would be submerged in water in order to join fully into the Christian community. Now, this part here is this section right here, and you can see it hopefully a lot better there. And it shows Jesus and Peter walking on water, walking on the Sea of Galilee after stepping out of this boat here. Jesus calms the water and they go for a walk on it. So it's one of his miracles. And so they're emphasizing here a few things about Jesus. And what they chose to emphasize in early Christianity is a little different than what tends to be focused on in various other periods. So we get early on our Jesus as kind of wonder worker, doing these amazing things. Like, for example, healing a figure who's often called the paralytic. And so here is an image of Jesus, and this is a man lying down on a bed because he is paralyzed, cannot stand. Jesus heals him, and then we see him over here standing up and carrying his bed on his back. He's so excited about having been healed, miraculously able to walk, that he just picks up his bed and off he goes with it. And so this is Jesus performing these amazing miracles, these wonders. So that's one of the main ways that we confront Jesus in this period. And you can see here, he's depicted as a young man, no beard, as we might think of him in very common imagery later on, dressed fairly simply. And without a lot of elaboration. He has no halo here. He isn't, grand, glorious, glowing. He's not clothed in fancy garments or anything like that. Very simple, pared down image. But the main event is what's going on in this arced fresco at the back here. This is a redrawing of it, and then we'll look at the original. But just to point out its main features, you can see here is a figure carrying a sheep on its shoulders and a flock of sheep here. And then at the figure's feet are two more figures on either side of a tree holding leaves to cover their groin. So these are Christ the Good Shepherd and then Adam and Eve below. The idea of the Good Shepherd is really popular in early Christianity. In fact, it is, and here's the actual images again, they're quite difficult to see owing to the poor preservation at the site, but we will manage. Christ the Good Shepherd is the most popular image of Christ early on. The first images that we get of him are of Christ as Good Shepherd. And so what we see here, he is a young man carrying this rather large sheep on his shoulders, standing by this flock. And this comes from two biblical texts. One is from Hebrew scriptures, a book called the Book of the Psalms. Psalms are songs, and they were written down purportedly by King David, who's a famous Jewish ruler, when he was a young shepherd boy. And so one of the Psalms, Psalm 23, is one you've all heard because it's in all the funeral scenes in all the movies, and it goes like this. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He makes me lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside quiet waters. He restores my soul. He guides me in paths of righteousness for his name's sake. Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for you are with me. Your rod and your staff, they comfort me. So this is an image of God. Now, this is a Hebrew text that was written by a Jew for a Jewish community, but it's describing God as a shepherd. And this is an agrarian society, a culture built around farming and grazing of animals. And so shepherds would have been a very familiar thing. Nowadays, there aren't a lot of shepherds around, so we don't tend to think of that as being that meaningful metaphor to, I think, a lot of us living in cities or suburbs, what have you. But um, there were a lot of shepherds back then, and shepherds care for their flock. So the flock comes to be the main Christian metaphor for the group of Christians, and that's who these sheep are. So the sheep are Christians, and Christ, Jesus Christ, is their shepherd, the good shepherd who cares for them. Um, and they are being told in this psalm they need not fear anything because their shepherd is there watching over them. Now, that's a Jewish text. There is another text that is explicitly Christian that comes from the Gospel of Luke. So there's a bunch of Jewish books, a bunch of scriptures. They are the most important ones kept in the Torah, which we talked about in the other lecture, the first 5 books. But then there's a whole lot of other Jewish scriptures that Christians will gather together and refer to as the quote unquote Old Testament. And then they add a bunch of new books, which are explicitly Christian. They call it in the New Testament. I put those in quotes, Old Testament, because that's an explicitly Christian framing of Jewish scriptures. Jews do not read the Old Testament. Jews read what they would think of as the Testament. It is Jewish scripture. It is the Jewish Bible. It is the Torah. It's also called the Tanakh. And so it is a Christian idea that Jewish texts are old and out of date and have been replaced by Christian texts. And so when we're talking about Jewish texts and Jews reading those texts, they are not the Old Testament. That's only when Christians borrow, reframe, and reinterpret them and use them in their own religion. But the 4 most important New Testament texts, explicitly Christian texts, are these things called the 4 Gospels. And they were purportedly written by Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. They claim to be eyewitnesses to the life and times of Jesus, but a lot of very good linguistic analysis has shown that actually they were all written at least a century after Jesus' life, at least several decades, and in some cases 100, maybe 150 years after he had died. So they probably are not the eyewitness accounts they claim to be, though they could preserve oral traditions of those accounts and then have been written down later. That's certainly possible. Luke's gospel has this thing called the parable of the lost sheep. And in the Gospels, Jesus often speaks in what are called parables. A parable is a simple story with a big message. A lot of children's stories are parables, and the idea is you want to teach, a big, important, complicated concept, but you want to explain that to a child. So you tell a story that's about bears or ducks or chickens to get that across. Well, parables work that way. And when early Christians were preaching, they wanted to preach to everybody, not just the most educated. In fact, among the earliest converts to Christianity were the least well-educated members of society quite often. Enslaved people were among early converts. Women who were denied access to a lot of educational opportunities in the Roman Empire were also very common among early converts. And so they were trying to preach to people who hadn't had formal religious training. And so these parables make sense. And this is the parable of the lost sheep from the Gospel of Luke. It says, quote, "Now the tax sinners were all gathered around to hear Jesus. But the Pharisees were a particular group of Jewish temple elders. But the Pharisees and the teachers of the law muttered, 'This man welcomes sinners and eats with them.' And then Jesus told them this parable. Suppose one of you had 100 sheep and loses one of them. Does he not leave the 99 in the open country and go after the lost sheep until he finds it? And then he calls his friends. He joyfully puts it on his shoulders and goes home, and he calls his friends and neighbors together and says, 'Rejoice with me, I have found my lost sheep.' I tell you that in the same way there will be more rejoicing in heaven over one sinner who repents than over 99 righteous people who do not need to repent." That's the image that we see here. It's Jesus, the good shepherd, having found his lost sheep, placed it on his shoulders, and returned joyfully to the flock. Well, the idea here is that Jesus cares about, so the text is arguing, everybody, each and every person out there, every lost soul, every sinner, he is interested in. And he will go out and find them and bring them back. Now, this was a really powerful message in the Roman Empire, because the Roman gods, they don't really care about anybody. They cared about themselves. They were interested in one another. They viewed humans as sort of entertainment. So when they got bored, they'd like turn on the TV and, kill people, start wars, break up romantic couples, throw fiery mountains on top of cities, make people lose their ships at sea, whatever. They didn't like people, apparently, very much. And religious practice in Roman polytheism consisted of sacrifice. People would make a sacrifice and get a kind of tit for tat. We give you this cow, which we burn upon your altar, and then you give us something in return. Very transactional relationship that Romans had with polytheistic gods. Jesus is a very different kind of God, which appealed to people, particularly, again, the poor, the outcasts, the people without access to the higher levels of society, who couldn't afford to sacrifice a cow or a sheep. It's very expensive items, which says you can't get Jupiter's attention unless you're already wealthy, in essence, right? Well, Jesus functioned very differently and appealed to potentially everybody. And so this is a scene that's about his outreach. It's a scene that makes a lot of sense in an early Christian moment of conversion. Now, that will change radically once large areas have been Christianized, and Christian imagery will switch from being focused on recruiting new Christians and switch to being about sort of enforcing systems of control over people who are already Christian. And we'll see that when we get into the Middle Ages in this course. Now, underneath Christ, remember, there's the scene of Adam and Eve, and they've got their hands holding leaves covering their nakedness, the tree is in between them. This is the scene of the Garden of Eden, the temptation and fall of humanity, where a serpent in the tree offers Eve the fruit of the tree of knowledge of good and evil, and she is tempted, and she takes it, and she eats it, and she offers fruit to Adam, and he eats it. This is the one rule that God had given them in the garden, and they are thrown out of the garden, and they live, the difficult life of suffering outside, having become, having fallen from grace into which they were originally born and placed. The image presents Christ as supplanting, literally being on top of Adam. And they would often refer to him in this period as the new Adam. So the first Adam, the first man born, his name literally means clay. Adam is the Hebrew word for clay because God, according to the Genesis narrative, created Adam out of clay and breathed life into him. So he's just called clay man, So he then falls, creates, it brings sin into the world, and then all human life is sin and suffering after that, according to this narrative. And then Christ comes and redeems, undoes, starts the clock anew, brings forgiveness and salvation. And so he is called the new Adam. So the old Adam is below, the new Adam standing above, offering hope, forgiveness, and even salvation, something that generally wasn't on the agenda in Roman polytheism at all. There are lots and lots of images of Christ the Good Shepherd, and they appear in very many forms. And the image on the left of the screen here, this is a particularly beautiful one that survives in one of the Roman catacombs, Roman burial sites, places like this where I am sort of standing today. And again, we see a youthful deity holding a sheep on his shoulders, and he's dressed in the simple clothing of a Roman shepherd. I offer you this image of Antinous, who was actually the lover of the Roman emperor Hadrian, but Hadrian enjoyed dressing up his beautiful young lover in a variety of kind of costumes, and this is Antinous dressed as a Greek shepherd. And so a good point of comparison, just the clothing is so very strikingly similar here. So this is, how a simple shepherd would dress. And so here he's presented as a simple shepherd. But it's worth bearing in mind, going all the way back to Dura Europos, that image that was created following mathematical formulas to meet a Greek cultural ideal for the male body. And so you note that contrapposto stance, that classical weight shift, the weight all being placed on one leg and the other leg dangling. You can see that Christ here, while presented as youthful and simple shepherd, is nonetheless presented following a model of an idealized human based on Greek and then Roman models. So yes, this is Christian, but it is Roman Christian art that we're seeing here, and it is as much embedded in older Roman and Greek traditions as it is in new Christian modes of thinking and practice. Now, The first one that I showed is this very beautiful lavish one. It's not that big, it's a couple of feet high, but there are also much simpler versions of the same. This is a relief panel similar, and this is yet another even simpler version of it, but you can see they're all quite the same. And there's one odd detail that's always stood out to me about these, which is, before I'd ever looked at these two, I'd always noticed how Jesus's hair here looks so much like the wool on the sheep, and I thought that was just kind of funny. But then when I look at these, I see that his hair looks like this wool, and here again, and in all three, the hair and wool look very different from each other's sculpture, but look so similar between man and sheep that it leads me to think this is a deliberate choice. And I think what that choice is saying is that, unlike the Roman gods, Christ is this unusual deity for being half God and half human, or rather, all God and all humans simultaneously. This is one of the kind of Christian mysteries, but it's showing that he identifies with his flock. He is like his flock. In fact, he is even embodied in a way like they are embodied. So his hair and the sheep's wool, one and the same. Now into the catacombs proper, where that statue of Christ the Good Shepherd was found. Most of the burials there were these very simple things. They're called loculi. That literally is just Latin for like place. And they would have all been plastered over. You can see some of the plaster surviving here, but most of it is gone. And they would just be simple burials, people placed in there. But there were also what are called a cubiculum, plural of that is cubicula, that were more elaborate. These would be for families, wealthier early Christian families. And they would have sometimes these elaborate fresco paintings. And this one shows, again, Christ the Good Shepherd in the center of what is a cross motif, a reference to the cross of Jesus Christ. And at each of the corners are figures called orants, and they are praying figures, their hands up like this. The orans position is the prayer position. The people in that position are called orants. And this is the traditional, it was a traditional Jewish prayer pose, and it becomes the sort of standard early Christian prayer pose. So, people think, praying with hands clasped, that's only invented as a prayer pose really later, or popularized later. So these are members of the Christian community praying. And again, you see a flock of sheep just below one of these scenes, reminding that the sheep and the followers of Christ, they're one and the same. And there's Christ again, holding the sheep on his shoulders, surrounded by a more flock of sheep. So these worshipers and these sheep and the burials beneath them are all representations of the Christian community. Here we zoom in on two more early Christian catacomb images of Christ as the Good Shepherd. And you see how similar they appear, how they're kind of following in a standard kind of pattern in the sculptures, in the frescoes. But it doesn't take that long for images of Christ to start shifting. So here we are now in the 4th century. And we have an image of St. Peter striking a rock and making water come out of it, one of his miracles. We have two martyrs, Felix and Adauctus, on either side of an image of Christ. Martyrs being people who died for their religious convictions in times of Roman persecutions. And then up here, with a very different image of God, who is presented with two Greek letters on either side of his head, the Alpha and the Omega. And Alpha and Omega are the first and last letters of the Greek alphabet. It's sort of like saying the A and the Z. And this was a way of arguing that God was this all-encompassing figure. There at the very beginning, the creator, the person who made the being who made the universe, made the stars and the planets, made Adam and Eve and all the rest, that's the Alpha, but also the judge of people at the end of time, the Omega. So Alpha and Omega. And we see him here with that reference toward judgment at the end of time, becoming older, bearded, looking much more stern. Already in the 4th century, we're starting to move away from the popularity of the Good Shepherd image, that welcoming figure of salvation, and starting to think about images of judgment. We see a close-up of this figure of God as the Alpha and Omega, surrounded by this starry sky. And just one last image is this little beautiful ivory box. It's called a casket here, but it's not like a casket for a person. It's a box that may have been used to hold the Eucharist, the bread or wafers for the Mass ceremony. Uh, and it has on it, on four sides, a series of images from the life of Christ. Here you see Christ carrying his cross on the way to his own crucifixion. But the scene I want to really focus on is this one that shows the suicide of Judas and the crucifixion of Jesus, because we're getting something very new here. Here now we're in the 5th century and we have a crucifixion scene. Early Christian images, the earliest ones, do not give us the crucifixion. And it's very interesting because the crucifixion will become the dominant Christian image in later periods. Why would that be? Well, remember, if you're trying to convert Roman polytheists, the gods that the Roman polytheists have are, Jupiter, thrower of thunderbolts. They're, the god that is the sun and the god that is the sea, Neptune, right? These powerful, fearsome forces. So early Christians, when they wanted to convert people, they didn't lead with, our God is a man who was executed by Romans and died on a cross. That's not going to bring in Christians from worshiping, Jupiter and Poseidon, Neptune. So they lead with, our God will bring you salvation, bring you to heaven, cares about you. Roman gods don't bring you to heaven. There isn't really a heaven in the Roman afterlife. So they go with the good shepherd, this figure that offers you something vaster and greater than anything the Roman gods ever did, and asks less of you as well. He is the sacrifice. You don't have to make the sacrifice. He makes himself into that sacrifice. He is the lamb, the sacrificial figure. And that's what the crucifixion scene is about. Christ sacrificing himself in order to bring about salvation. Now, this scene will become more and more and more popular as we move from the early Christian period into the Middle Ages, as the Middle Ages move on from the early Middle Ages toward the Gothic period, when crucifixion scenes will become omnipresent and increasingly emotional and brutal. This one presents the figure of Christ triumphant over death, upright, vertical, eyes open, staring straight out, showing his triumph over death, implying ultimately his resurrection after. Whereas later images will focus more and more on the pain and suffering and humanity of Jesus in these last moments of his life. Okay, that's it. Those are my 2 lectures on Dura Europos' synagogue and other ancient Jewish art, and Dura Europos' house church Domus Ecclesiae, and a couple other early Christian pieces. See ya.